The clay tablet is still warm, or at least it was warm 3,000 years ago. It sits in a museum now, under cold glass and harsh lights. But when it was first pulled from the dirt, it was resting in a layer of ash so thick it had fused the rubble of a palace together. The tablet is a letter. It is addressed to the King of Cyprus. And it is begging for help. The writer is King of Ugarit. His city is one of the wealthiest ports in the ancient world. But right now his city is burning. The letter reads, "My father, behold, the enemy's ships came, my cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. Does not my father know that all my troops and chariots are in the Hittite country, and all my ships are in the land of Lycia? Thus, the country is abandoned to itself." The letter was never sent. The clay was never baked in a kiln to preserve it. It was baked by the fire that consumed the palace. The runner who was supposed to carry it likely died before the clay cooled. This is the Ghost Army, a force without a single king, without a unified empire, and without a permanent home. Yet in a span of just 50 years, they erased 5 of the greatest civilizations on earth. They broke the Hittite Empire. They burned the Mycenaean palaces. They turned the great trading hub of Ugarit into a parking lot of ash. They pushed the mighty Egyptian empire to the absolute brink of destruction. And then, just as suddenly as they appeared on the edges of the map, they vanished. How does a nameless, kingless force dismantle the first globalized world of the ancient era, only to evaporate into history like smoke? To understand the end of the world, you first have to understand the world that ended. We call it the Late Bronze Age. It peaked around 1300 BC, and if you could look at a map of the Mediterranean at that time, you would not see a collection of isolated, primitive tribes. You would see a deeply connected, highly globalized supersystem. You had the Egyptians in the south, controlling the Nile and the gold. You had the Hittites in the north, ruling the rugged highlands of Anatolia with their massive chariot armies. You had the Mycenaeans in Greece, building cyclopean stone fortresses, and you had the Levantine city-states, like Ugarit, acting as the middlemen, trading tin from the east, copper from Cyprus, and olive oil from everywhere. These empires did not just fight, they traded. They signed treaties. They married their princesses to each other. They sent diplomatic gifts. If a Hittite king was sick, the Egyptian pharaoh sent his personal physician. It was an ancient G7, a complex, interdependent web of power. But complexity has a dark side. When a system is highly connected, a shock in one area does not stay in one area, it travels. The first tremors started at the edges of the map. Around 1250 BC, the coastal cities of the Levant began reporting strange sightings. Lookouts on the walls of Ugarit and Byblos saw ships on the horizon. But these were not the standard trading galleys, and they were not the organized navies of the great empires. These ships were different. They were smaller, faster, and they had a distinct design. And the men on them wore helmets with strange sweeping horns. At first, the empires treated this as a border nuisance, a pirate problem. The Hittites sent a few troops to patrol the coast. The local governors wrote letters to each other, complaining about the lack of support. Then the pirates stopped just raiding. They started staying. They brought ox carts. They brought women and children. They brought household goods. This was not a raiding party looking for quick plunder. This was a mass migration. They were looking for a new home. And they were willing to kill everyone already living there to get it. Historians call them the Sea Peoples, but that is a modern label. The ancient Egyptians recorded their names in a long, rolling list of syllables. the Shurden, the Shekelish, the Luka, the Ekwesh, and the most dangerous of them all, the Peliset. They did not have a capital city. They did not have a single commander. But they had something the great empires had forgotten how to fight against. Here is the part that breaks the timeline. The great empires of the Bronze Age relied on one specific way of war. The chariot. A Bronze Age chariot was a tank. It was a fast, two-wheeled platform pulled by highly trained horses, carrying an elite warrior who fired arrows from a composite bow. It was devastating on an open field, but it required flat ground. It required massive logistical support to feed the horses, and it required years of expensive training to master. The chariot was a weapon of the elite. It was built to fight other elites. The Sea Peoples did not care about the rules of elite warfare. They brought a new tactical reality to the Mediterranean. Infantry skirmishers. They fought on foot. They carried long, straight swords designed for slashing, not just thrusting. They carried javelins. And they fought in loose, flexible groups. When the great empires sent their chariots to crush the Sea Peoples, the invaders simply scattered into the rough, rocky terrain where the chariots could not follow. Then they swarmed. They threw javelins at the horses. They closed the distance with their long swords. They dragged the elite warriors out of their expensive tanks and killed them in the dirt. It was a complete tactical mismatch. The empires were bringing chess pieces to a knife fight. The first major domino to fall was the island of Cyprus. Cyprus was the copper heart of the ancient world. Without Cypriot copper, the bronze industry of the entire Mediterranean would starve. The Sea Peoples hit the island hard. The cities burned. The copper mines were abandoned. When the copper stopped flowing, the bronze swords of the empires started turning green and brittle. The supply chain was broken. Then, the ghost army turned north, toward the Hittite Empire. The Hittites were the superpower of the north. Their capital, Hattusa, was a massive fortress carved into the rocky highlands of modern-day Turkey. Their king, Suppiluliuma II, was not a man who backed down. He actually managed to assemble a fleet and meet the Sea Peoples in a naval battle. It is the first recorded naval battle in human history, and Suppiluliuma lost. With the Hittite navy destroyed, the gates to the empire were wide open. The Sea Peoples poured into Anatolia. They did not just defeat the Hittite army. They erased the state. They burned Hattusa to the ground. They slaughtered the ruling class. The great Hittite Empire, which had rivaled Egypt for centuries, simply ceased to exist. The treaties were voided. The embassies went dark. If you were a king in the Mediterranean at this moment, you would be looking at your map and watching the lights go out, one by one. And this is where the pattern becomes terrifying. It is not just a series of military defeats. It is a systems collapse. Because the empires were so connected, the fall of one accelerated the fall of the others. When the Hittites fell, the grain shipments to the Levant stopped. When Cyprus fell, the copper stopped. When the trade routes were cut, the economies of the surviving cities hyperinflated. Famine set in, internal rebellion sparked. The Sea Peoples did not have to defeat every empire. They just had to push the complex system hard enough, and the system defeated itself. By 1200 BC, the Ghost Army was moving south down the coast of the Levant toward the ultimate prize, Egypt. But Egypt was not the Hittite Empire. Egypt was ruled by Ramesses III. Ramesses had been watching the map burn for 20 years. He had seen the refugees pouring in from the north, telling wild stories of horned men and burning cities. He knew they were coming, and unlike the Hittites, Ramesses did not rely on the old ways of war. He prepared a trap. The sea peoples were moving down the coast, their ships hugging the shoreline, their ox carts rolling through the dry brush of the Mycenae. They were confident. They had broken every army they had met. They believed Egypt was just the next domino. They sailed their ships into the mouths of the Nile Delta. But as they entered the narrow river channels, they realized the water was unnaturally still. There were no Egyptian ships to meet them. Then the reeds on the riverbanks parted. Ramesses had hidden his archers in the tall marsh grass. He had lined the shores with thousands of men holding long bows. He had deliberately left the river mouth open, letting the sea peoples sail deep into the trap where their ships could not turn around. The Egyptian archers stood up, and they fired. It was a massacre. The sky went dark with arrows. The sea people's ships, packed with men and supplies, had nowhere to go. They tried to beach the ships and fight on land, but the Egyptian infantry was waiting. Ramesses had also adapted his tactics. He did not just send chariots. He sent heavy infantry to hold the line, while his archers poured fire into the invaders. He used the terrain. He used the river. He used the very geography of the delta to crush them. The Battle of the Delta was a total victory for Egypt. The sea peoples were broken. The survivors were taken as prisoners, branded with the mark of the pharaoh, and settled in the southern Levant as mercenaries. Egypt survived, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. The cost of the war bankrupted the state. The empire never recovered its former glory. The new kingdom slowly bled out over the next 2 centuries, eventually fracturing into pieces. And now we return to that tablet, the one from Ugarit. Archaeologists found it in the ruins of the palace, hardened not by a potter's oven, but by the inferno that consumed the city. It was never sent. The runner never left. King Hammurabi was likely dead before the clay cooled. It is the ultimate open loop, a plea for help that arrived 3,000 years too late. It sits in a museum today, a permanent, physical record of the exact moment the ancient world died. The king was asking for troops that were already dead. He was asking for ships that were already at the bottom of the sea. He was asking for a system that had already collapsed. So, what happened to the ghost army? Where did they go? They did not vanish into thin air. They just changed their name. The Peliset, the most prominent faction of the sea peoples, were settled by the Egyptians in the coastal towns of the southern Levant. Over the next few centuries, they intermarried with the local populations. They adopted the local languages. But they kept their distinct culture, their distinct pottery, and their distinct ironworking techniques. You know them by a different name, the Philistines. The very people who would become the greatest rivals of the ancient Israelites. The builders of Gaza and Ashkelon were the remnants of the ghost army that destroyed the Bronze Age. They did not disappear. They just planted their feet in the ash and started over. This is not a story about a single invasion. This is not a story about a change in weapons. This is not a story about a few bad kings. This is a story about what happens when a connected world forgets how to survive its own complexity. When we look back at the late Bronze Age collapse, it is easy to feel a sense of distance. They lived 3,000 years ago. They fought with bronze swords and rode in wooden chariots. But the mechanics of their fall are deeply, uncomfortably familiar. They built a world that relied on perfect, uninterrupted supply chains. They believed their complexity made them invincible. They ignored the warning signs at the edges of the map until the fire was at their own gates. And when the shock came, it did not come from a single, overwhelming enemy. It came from a cascading failure of everything they relied on. The copper stopped, the grain stopped, the alliances stopped, The ghost army was just the spark. The world was already covered in gasoline. There are three things we must take away from the ashes of Ugarit and Hattusa. First, complexity is a vulnerability. The more connected a system becomes, the more efficiently it transfers wealth, but also the more efficiently it transfers collapse. A single broken node can bring down the entire network. Second, adaptability is the only true defense. The Hittites and the Mycenaeans died because they kept fighting the last war. They trusted their chariots and their high walls. Ramesses survived because he looked at the changing reality, adapted his tactics, and built a trap for the new world. And third, the silence of the ashes is the loudest warning. King Amurapi wrote his final letter, begging for a rescue that was never coming. He trusted the system to save him, right up until the roof caught fire. We live in a world that is more connected, more complex, and more interdependent than the Bronze Age empires could ever have imagined. We have global supply chains. We have digital networks. We have alliances that span the globe. We look at our modern world, and we see the same towering wealth, the same deep connections, the same belief in our own invincibility. But the map is always changing, and the ships are always on the horizon. Which civilization collapse in this video hit you the hardest? Tell me below. The clay tablet of King Amurapi is still warm. Or at least, it was warm 3,000 years ago. It reminds us that empires do not always fall with a dramatic, cinematic explosion. Sometimes, they fall because the runner never left the palace. Sometimes, they fall because the letter was never sent. And sometimes, the ghost army was never the real enemy at all. The real enemy was the fragile, beautiful, terrifying system they built, waiting for the exact right moment to tear itself apart.